Turn our Bibles tonight to the book of 2 Corinthians. We'll be in 2 Corinthians chapter number 4. And while you're turning there, let me once again thank you for attending this year and being part of our conference. I truly believe that God has met with us this week, and for that I'm very grateful. And I appreciate you being here. Would encourage you to be back next year, and you can go ahead and register and be a part of what God does next year. And I spoke to a pastor from California today who is planning on being here next year, and I'm thankful for what God is doing with this conference and being a help and an encouragement. That is the purpose of that. We need encouragement. We need help. We need to be challenged to do more for the cause of Christ. And so I would encourage you to be back next year. I want to bring a message, the last message of the week. We've heard a lot of preaching this week. We've heard a lot of good preaching this week. If we're to take the time tonight to start on one side and go across, and those who have been here all week, probably everybody have a different message that the Lord used to speak specifically to their heart about something. But certainly every message spoke to our heart and challenged us and helped us. And tonight, I want to bring a thought. I preached this message. I preached this message in our church, and so those that are members here, you may recognize this, but it's not going to hurt you to hear it again. But I want to be a help and a blessing as we leave. We do this conference as a church because we want to be a help. We want to be a blessing. We want to encourage the household of faith. I have a burden for preachers. I grew up in a pastor's home. I have some insight of the things that a pastor has to do, as the pastor endures, the burden. I'm not painting a picture it's all bad, it's all of those things, but it's burdensome. I know what it's like for the pastor's wife. I've seen the things that my mother had to do by just being married to my dad, and that's a burden. It was a burden in itself, and so you see that now being a pastor myself and understanding that. And I'm very sensitive to the needs of preachers and specifically pastors because I know the burdens that I carry. I know the things that I've endured, and we need God first of all, but we need one another. We need is why the message that was just preached is so important for us to encourage one another, be a part of what God is doing. I want us to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4. I'm not going to say what every person hates to hear a preacher say. I'm not going to be very long. But it is a taco bar tonight, so I will not be very long for the service. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. I heard one pastor say that's the description of a church business meeting right there. But I'll pause and say this. We look at our world, we look at our nation, we look at the things that are going on. It's not new. Hard times are not new. Being in the ministry is wonderful, but it's not all easy. But in spite of all that, we get this sense of the Apostle Paul's outlook. Verse 10, always bearing about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our body. For we which live are always delivered unto death for Jesus' sake. The life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our mortal flesh. So then death worketh in us, but life in you. We have the same spirit of faith, according as it is written, I believed, and therefore have I spoken. We also believe, and therefore speak. Verse 14, knowing that he which raised up the Lord Jesus shall raise up us also by Jesus, and shall present us with you. For all things are for your sakes, that the abundant grace might, through the thanksgiving of many, redound to the glory of God. For which cause we faint not, but through our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. I want to draw your attention to verse number 16, the first part of that verse. For which cause we faint not. I want to take those three words, we faint not. The Apostle Paul is making a declaration. We faint not. The Apostle Paul had it easy, didn't he? No, he did not. But in spite of what he endured, he said, we faint not. There's persecutions. We faint not. We have hard times. We faint not. What Paul is saying is not what you think he's saying if you just look at it from the surface. But there's the idea of we faint not. Father, help us tonight as we consider these truths. May you bless your people. May we be helped one more time in this meeting. May we leave as we conclude in just a few moments. May we echo the words of the Apostle Paul, we faint not. I believe you're returning soon. May it be true of everyone in this room when you do call us home. May the words on our lips be, we faint not. The adversity we may face between now and that time, may we determine we faint not. Father, bless us tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. The word faint, as it's used here, can be defined as to sink into dejection, to lose courage or spirit. Dejected, depressed, dispirited. Think about that word when Paul says, for which cause. There's some reasons why he determined not to faint. More than giving a testimony of during some times we did not get distressed, it was because of those times we are stating the fact that we faint not. To sink into that dejection, to lose courage or spirit, we see in verse 8 and verse 9 some of the things that he endured. But let me say by way of introduction tonight, and listen very carefully, I'll build some things and then give us a few things to think about and we'll conclude the service. We as part of God's church, be part of His family, are expected to be and are part of ministry. We call this the Preacher's Delight Conference because we want to be a help and encouragement to preachers. But we understand that it's more than just the pastor or a missionary or somebody who is an assistant pastor. And we get the question every year, is it just for preachers? And the answer is no. It's for everybody who would like to be a part of what God is doing. But the point I'm trying to make, whether you're the pastor, the Elijah, the Elisha, or somebody else, you are supposed to be in ministry. Every child of God should be in ministry. Every child of God should be serving in some capacity. You may not serve like I serve. You may not serve like somebody else serves, but God has a service for you. God did not found His church, save us from hell, put us as part of His church to sit back and do nothing. There is an area for us to serve. I know what we mean when we say we want our young people to go into full-time Christian ministry. But let me just clarify something. Every child of God should be in full-time Christian ministry. What we mean by that is perhaps they get a paycheck. But we have a mindset today that is hurting our churches where if I'm not on church staff or I don't have a position, that I'm not in ministry. Let me just remind all of us, and preacher, you don't need to be reminded you're in ministry. But all of us are to be part of ministering to somebody. Ministry will require sacrifices. Think about preachers whining to one another about the sacrifices they have to make. We signed up for it. We count the cost, knowing that there's a cost to serving God. But there is sacrifices that must be made, and ministry will bring afflictions. Paul speaks of them. I believe, you look at the book of Job, it is well documented in the book of Job that Satan enters into the presence of God and accuses man, and God presents Job to him and says, if you consider my servant Job. And of course, Satan says the reason why that he serves you the way he does, because you've been so good to him. You protected him, and why wouldn't he serve you? You know the story. God says you can do whatever you want to do, but you can't take his life. And he went through afflictions because God allowed it. Friend, let me tell you, just because somebody's going through an affliction, it's not because necessarily that they've done something wrong. I don't think that's the only time that conversation's ever happened between Satan and God. I don't think it's the only time God says, well, have you considered this faithful person? And because of ministry, because of opposition, because Satan is not interested in us succeeding, preaching of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, there's affliction that's going to come. There's opposition that's going to come. I think it's important for us to be reminded of that. If you're not a pastor and you are here this evening, you serve in ministry, understand something. There's affliction, there's opposition. But let me say this, ministry is rewarding. It's rewarding. It's rewarding to give your life for something greater than yourself. It's rewarding when one day you leave this world and you leave behind the lives of others that you invested in, who they wouldn't have ever heard the plan of salvation if you weren't the one that gave it. If they wouldn't have been able to navigate that difficult time in their life if God hadn't allowed you to be there. Or perhaps it was your prayers and you're not even aware that it was your prayers that gave them the strength they needed. Ministry is rewarding. But ministry plus life can be overwhelming. Everybody in ministry also has a life. I know sometimes you don't feel like you have a life because of ministry. But if you are in ministry, you still have family responsibilities. You still have responsibilities of things you have to take care of. Your kids still get sick, and your spouse still gets sick, and there's tragic things that come into your life. And sometimes we say, why is God doing this to me? You got to separate those things. Yes, there are persecutions that come. There are afflictions that come. But a lot of what we look to heaven and say, God, why are you allowing this? Is just life. The book of Ecclesiastes reminds us that it's just life. If we weren't in ministry, we would experience those things. But we take ministry, which keeps us busy, but we have life. This is what happens when ministry demands our attention, demands our strength, demands our time, demands our energy. Life doesn't always pause. Life doesn't always get easy when ministry is difficult. Usually the way it happens, ministry's running smooth, life is running smooth. Then when one starts with some difficulty, it's not too far behind it. Life happens with ministry. When that happens, even though ministry is rewarding, it's overwhelming. Let me also say, by way of introduction, it's normal to become overwhelmed. In verse number 7, Paul reminds the church at Corinth that they're just earthen vessels. This is good to say for those who, to understand about your pastor, he's an earthen vessel, which means he has limitations, which he has life, he has all of those things. That's the reality. But I say this tonight, that if you're in ministry, whether you're a pastor or you work with your pastor or you're a church member that's trying to advance the cause of Christ, there's only so much you can't handle. Maybe I'm preaching just to myself tonight, but I know what it's like to feel overwhelmed. And in my experience in life and as a pastor, there's a lot of times that I'll have a church member, I'll have a Christian, and sometimes even another pastor say, I don't know what I'm doing. I must be doing something wrong because I can't keep up with life and I can't keep up with ministry. I feel this way about life and ministry, and I'm overwhelmed, and we have a tendency to say, what do I have to give up because I'm overwhelmed? Or we allow the devil to tell us that you're not cut out for that. It's time for you to give up your ministry. Because after all, if you can't keep up with life, you probably shouldn't be in ministry. But I'll submit to you that you take ministry out, and it's hard to keep up with life. But when you have life in ministry, and we have the normal afflictions that come from life because we're in earthen vessels. Friend, don't listen to the naysayers. Well, if you can't give up, you just ought to be a better Christian. Sometimes you can pray and pray and pray and pray and ask the Lord to help you feel better. Ask the Lord to give you the strength, and it may be His will that you don't have it. Oh, Lord, would you pray and pray and pray? Praying for a balance isn't going to clean those dishes in the sink. You're not going to go to your clock and there'll be an extra hour there. Time's not going to stand still. We feel overwhelmed. But let me say, just because you're overwhelmed, let me say it's normal. Please follow me tonight. If Paul and Timothy were aware of the possibility of fainting, then you and I must also be aware. We don't find a warning about getting overwhelmed. Can we be honest? If verse 8 and 9 were our testimony, how can we not be overwhelmed? How can we not feel like we're just trying to keep our head above water? It's an overwhelming thing. Why? Because we're humanity. We're not deity. We don't have supernatural ability. We don't have supernatural strength. Our strength is gone. Our wisdom has limitations. We get overwhelmed, and sometimes we say, there must be something wrong with me because I'm overwhelmed. Ministry must be wrong. Life must be wrong. I've got to choose one or another. I'm not saying we have our priorities wrong, but what I'm saying is if your ministry and life, you're going to be overwhelmed. But that's not what Paul is reminding us of. That's not what Paul is saying. He didn't say, we aren't overwhelmed. What did he say? He said, we faint not. We may not be able to prevent being overwhelmed, but we do not have to faint when overwhelmed. Being limited and feeling overwhelmed by our limitations and difficulties is not failure. See, why are you preaching this? Because I know what it's like to feel like a failure. Because at 11:30 at night, I missed a text. I know what it's like to feel like a failure when my strength is not what it needs to be. I know what it's like to talk to those in ministry and say, Pastor, what am I doing wrong? I can't keep up at home. I can't keep up with my kids. I can't keep up with ministry. I'm just a failure. No, what it means is we're human, and we need a God to work through us. You're not a failure if you feel overwhelmed. You're not a failure if you're doing the best you can, and I'm trying to help my church, and I'm trying to help my people, but I just don't have enough time in the day. Being limited is not a failure. I should have done better in that. Well, you're limited. I forgot that. You're limited. How come I didn't see that? You're limited. How come I can't get done everything that I need to get done? You're limited. If your health fails, you cannot do what you could do if you had good health. If tragedy comes, it affects you. If persecution comes, it affects you. If you feel overwhelmed, we allow the enemy to tell us that we've failed. But I want to tell you tonight, you haven't failed. Preacher, you haven't failed if you can't keep up with everything. I'm overwhelmed. Does that mean I shouldn't be in ministry? Well, we should focus on not fainting instead of not being overwhelmed. Because being overwhelmed is unavoidable, but fainting is avoidable. Please don't miss this. So many times in the Christian life, ministry and life, we're not looking at the answer. We're just looking at the problem. We say, I'm overwhelmed. I need to get this pressure off of me. So what do? Well, I either have to neglect my family or I have to neglect my ministry. Let me tell you something. If God gave you a family, He doesn't want you to neglect that family. If you have a life you have to live, God doesn't want you to neglect that. But if God gave you ministry, He doesn't want you to neglect that either. Well, he gave me a family that has needs. He gave me life I have to care to. He gave me a ministry that's busy. And even if you serve as a Sunday school teacher or you're a layman helping your church, it's like the pastor just came in. He said he prayed about it. I didn't pray about it, but he prayed about it. Said I'm supposed to do this. It's overwhelming. We should focus on not fainting instead of not being overwhelmed. We don't like the feeling of being overwhelmed. So what would we do? I want to get something off of me so I'm not overwhelmed anymore. I need to step back in ministry. The Lord's impressed it upon me to start a new ministry in my church, and I can't do that because I'm already overwhelmed. We want to do that which would make us feel that way, but we're focusing on the wrong thing. We should not focus on not fainting instead of not being overwhelmed. We should focus on not fainting because being overwhelmed is unavoidable. There are times in life there's nothing you can do to not be overwhelmed. Nothing. You men know this, pastoring your church is not something a man can even do. It's only a supernatural God that supersedes man's limitations. I mean, he puts a message on your heart, and people in that church are so different. Old and young and different backgrounds, and all have different needs. But yet the Spirit of God can take a message and meet the needs of everybody in that room. Man can't do that. Sometimes we say, what do I need to do to not be overwhelmed? But let me just remind you, being overwhelmed is unavoidable. But fainting is avoidable. So I can be overwhelmed, and I can also say, we faint not. I can barely keep my head above water, as the saying goes. But I can also say, we faint not. How do we do that? Paul writes about it right here in the Scripture. Let me say, number one, to faint not requires the right perspective. Too many times we have the wrong focus, the wrong perspective. What's the right perspective? It's found there in verse number 17. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment. Well, I grew up in a pastor's home. I grew up around church. I grew up around the things of God, and I'm thankful for that. And you hear testimony after testimony, you read story after story of afflictions that God allowed into the life of His servants. Why does He do that? So that He can get the glory. God sometimes allows things to come into our life not to punish us, but so that He can be glorified. That affliction, and how many times I have said this, Lord, if you did not allow this affliction to come, I could have served you better. If I did not have this limitation, and friend, let me tell you, it comes from a heart that wants to do for God. But my finite mind says, it's affliction keeps me from doing what I could do. Or you have somebody in your church who's serving, and an affliction comes, and it's just not possible for them to do what they did anymore. Say, God, more could get done if there wasn't this affliction. We have to be reminded that God allows affliction so that He can be glorified. But it says light affliction. Sometimes we have a problem with what God says, don't we? Well, I have an affliction. It don't feel very light. It's hard to function with my affliction. The affliction that I carry, it's hard for this mind to get over it. Whatever that affliction may be, God says it's light. Listen very carefully. God said it was light. He did not say it was easy. I don't know why I must be a horrible Christian because my affliction does not feel easy. That's not what God said. He said it's a light affliction. Maybe you're sitting out there saying, I'm still confused because it don't feel very light either. Light is not the same as easy. These afflictions that Paul managed, Paul had some afflictions, didn't he? But Paul still had to manage his life. He had to manage ministry. Paul had that thorn in the flesh. You know what I'm talking about? He asked the Lord, would you remove it? He asked him multiple times. God chose not to remove it, but gave him the grace to deal with it. Paul had to deal with his human frailty, which in his mind got in the way of using his days for God. How many times, Christian, have you said, if I didn't have to deal with this, I could do this for God, I could do this for God, I could do this for God. But it's not an easy affliction, it's a light affliction. What does he give us? He gives us his grace. He speaks of it in verse 15, for all things are for your sakes, that the abundant grace might through the thanksgiving of many redound to the glory of God. God gives us his grace, it makes it manageable. We're reminded it's for a moment. How is it light? I've illustrated this before, but Joe, I'll let you help me again. You have this affliction, you have this burden. Maybe it's disease. Maybe it's heartache. Maybe, as every Bible preacher has, you've got an enemy. And they afflict you. They afflict you. Maybe it's a wayward child. Whatever the burden is, it's hard. This is what we want from God. God, would you come and you take this burden away? I'm overwhelmed. I'm still trying to rear my children. I'm still trying to do the things in life that I need to do. Would you take it off of me so I can run a little faster? So I can endure a little longer? God, I'm in the place you put me to serve, the people that I love and I want to serve, the community that you're in, I want them to know you. If I could go longer, I could reach more. We want God to come and take this affliction or this burden off of us. He says it's a light affliction. Don't you wish you were as good a Christian as Paul, that your afflictions felt light? But he wasn't saying it was light like he didn't feel it. What he was saying is God has given us afflictions and persecutions and we're overwhelmed. But by the grace of God, what he does, God gives us his strength. And what was a heavy burden now feels light. And we still walk, but now the load's lighter. Because he didn't take the affliction away, but by his grace, he says, let me just give you some strength. And what feels heavy without me will feel light with me. Thank you. And so he may not take that affliction, but that grace is a light affliction. And you can walk to the pulpit and preach with a burden on your shoulders. You can go home and do what you need to do with your family, even though there's affliction there. Because the grace of God helps us have a light affliction. It's not easy, but it becomes light because of God's grace. Aren't you thankful for the grace of God? Well, how many times have we got up and said, I don't know how I'm going to get through this day, but life is demanding that I do this today. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I can't tell you how many times I have somebody come to me, Pastor, I don't know how I'm going to get through the day. I don't know how I'm going to deal with this situation. My life is falling apart. My home is falling apart. I don't know what to do. And my counsel is always the same. I don't have answers for you, but just get through today. Amen. Just do what I can't get through today. And I talk to him the next day. What do I do today? Get through today. What is that? It's an affliction. It's heavy. It's not easy. But by the grace of God, he gives us strength and is light. Friend, we got to quit looking for God to say, the only time I can serve you is when life is easy. When everything meshes perfectly. I'm going to step back and I'm not going to move forward because life is just too difficult. Life is overwhelming. Ministry can be overwhelming. You put the two together, you don't know how you're going to do it all. We don't put off the ministry. We don't put off our family. Well, I have these afflictions. To faint not requires the right perspective. I've got this burden I wish I didn't have. But I'm thankful I have God to help me carry it. I've got affliction I wish I didn't have. But I got God and his grace It sure feels light. That's why we look at people who are serving us. I don't know how they're doing that. They're not. God's grace is. Number 2, to faint not requires the right focus. Look at verse 18. While we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. We have got to stop measuring by what we see. To faint not requires the right focus. We have got to stop serving, doing ministry, fulfilling our responsibilities, just so we can post it on social media so people think we're a success. We have got to keep our focus eternal. If I didn't have this burden, if I didn't have these limitations, if I didn't have this in my life that hinders me, I could do more. We think this. Well, I feel like such a failure because this broken heart or this burden is limiting me, but God just wants me to finish my course. And I may not be able to do everything that I'd like to do, but we tend to focus on what is seen. I've been overwhelmed. I shouldn't be overwhelmed. We've already discussed that. Being overwhelmed, I don't believe, is a sin. It just means we're human. Having limitations is not a sin. I can't do everything that's required of me. That is not a sin. It means we're human. But how do we deal with that? How do we not faint? Because if we think about that, we'll quit. If we think about that, we'll sink into dejection. We'll lose our courage. We'll lose our spirit. I got to get up again today and face this. How do I not lose my courage in that? I have the right focus. The result I may never see in my life, but the result is measured in heaven. What we don't see with these limitations that keep us from doing a work like we would like to do or fulfilling what we would like to accomplish, there's somebody we don't even know is watching us that sees the glory of God, that sees the grace of God, that gets strength by what God is doing, and that is not measured on this side of eternity, but in heaven. Are we here for God's purpose or God's glory or for the brethren? Are we here for God's glory, God's purpose, or for likes on social media? There are many who, they'll have those likes and that's its own thing, but God has somebody that He wants to just get something specific from, and He says, I'm going to put this into your life. Just don't quit. Don't faint. Keep your courage. I'll give you the strength you need, but keep your eyes on eternity. Keep your eyes on the judgment seat of Christ. Too many Christians quit because they measure their success by whether or not they're overwhelmed. I'm a failure because of my limitations. I'm a failure because of my afflictions. I'm a failure because of what I can't keep up with. No, eternity determines. Eternity. Don't measure your life by the temporal. Well, if you're a pastor and you're not concerned with attendance, that might be why it's not growing. I'm concerned with attendance, but it ain't always what I want it to be. It's not where I want it to be. It doesn't always happen the way I want it to happen. When you compare what we're doing versus the millions of people that are in the vicinity around us, it can be overwhelming. But I'm just supposed to please my God. You know what? There's going to be people in heaven that we don't even know they're there, and they picked up one of your gospel tracts from your church. They stormed out mad one day when you preached the gospel, and you was like, well, that didn't go well. But the Holy Spirit got a hold of them and softened their heart. And that seed that was planted with the faithfulness of doing what I'm supposed to do. Well, there's family members that will be right one day. There's family members that will be saved, and we won't even realize it because we were just faithful to do, and we kept our eyes on that which is eternal and not on the temporal. Number 3, very quickly, to faint not requires the right habits. Verse number 16, for which cause we faint not, but through our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. We've got to have the right habits. The outward man. You may not be able to keep the outward man young, but you can keep the inward man young. You may not be able to keep the outward man strong, but you can keep the inward man strong. You may not be able to keep the outward man from being overwhelmed, but you can give peace to the inward man by renewing daily. Let me give you number 4, and we'll be through. To faint not requires the right motivation. We have a tendency sometimes to get caught up in the competition, if you will, of the race. One thing we've got to be reminded of as God's servants is God has a unique race for everybody. And we're to run our race and not compare our race. Because God did not choose me to run your race. He did not choose you to run my race. So what is the motivation? The motivation is the glory of God. He speaks of it in verse number 15 again, that grace, so that there be the glory of God. Let me summarize it this way, and we'll be done. God is glorified in and by my life, not by never being overwhelmed. God is glorified in and by my life, in your life, not by never having affliction. Don't fall into this trap when a brother has an affliction, being a miserable comforter. Oh, I knew. Well, you didn't know when he was writing you a love offering check. Isn't it amazing how that works? God is glorified in and by my life, not what I'm doing when everything is going exactly smooth. He's glorified in and by my life when I'm overwhelmed. The burden's heavy. The task is too big to accomplish. There's not enough hours in the day. There's not enough strength in this body. God is glorified when I'm overwhelmed and I faint not. I can be overwhelmed, but if I don't quit, God's glorified. We've made the wrong standard. The standard is I have to have everything exactly in order all the time. That's not reality. Pastor, I'm overwhelmed. I don't even want to imagine the way the houses look of the members of the Immanuel Baptist Church this week. I don't even want to imagine that. It's overwhelming. Pastor, if I had this Saturday and we didn't have if I wasn't there on Wednesday night, I need to stay home on Sunday night so that everything can be ready for the kids in the week. It's overwhelming. I can't keep up. And if I pulled back in being aggressive to reach my community and I canceled this on this evening and this on this afternoon, I could keep up a little better. But friend, God's given us a task and a responsibility that we have to fulfill. Well, what happens when I get overwhelmed and there's life and you take ministry and you put those together and I just can't do it? That's when the grace of God gives you the strength you need. You just say, there may be trouble on every side, but I'm not distressed. So how can he say that? Because the standard was not whether or not he had trouble. The standard was whether or not the grace of God was sufficient for him to endure the trouble. He could say, yet we are perplexed, but not in despair. I don't know how we're going to get through it, But God gets us through it. We faint not. Well, this helped me in my life and ministry. When I was convinced by the Spirit of God, what we know. If you're not overwhelmed at some point in your life and ministry, you're not alive. I've heard this, and it goes against everything that's in me. I've heard this from people I went to Bible college with. Well, life's a lot less stressful when I got rid of this ministry. When, hey, we've got what we need. Let me put it in context for the Immanuel Baptist Church. God's given us 20 beautiful acres. We've got a great church. Pastor, why would we stress ourselves to try and grow and try and build? I've heard that. It's a lot less stress since I didn't get caught up in numbers. Don't misunderstand me. It's not all about a number. But I will say a number represents a soul. The point I'm making is, if we judge what we do in ministry by whether or not we're overwhelmed or perplexed or burdened, we won't do anything for God. Or we will limit ourselves in what we can do for God. Because this is just flesh. This is an earthen vessel. What you have is an earthen vessel. It has limitations. It can't do everything that's required. And life brings afflictions that you never dreamed about. That you never could have known were coming. That you could have never been prepared for. And it seemingly comes along and says, everything that I've been putting in your heart to do, what I've called you to do, or where I've placed you to do it, this life has come along, and it seems like that's the big obstacle to doing the very thing I wanted you to do. But God comes along and says, even though you're overwhelmed, why don't we have the words of the Apostle Paul and say, we faint not. We're not losing our courage. Because the results aren't determined down here. They're determined up there. Well, I'm getting older. I'm just imagining what these men say. I'm getting older. I can't do what I used to do. But you still got to faint not. And don't quit. And don't give in. Just a little challenge the Lord put on my heart to share with all of us. I'm fired up after a week like this. I'm tired, but I'm fired up after a week like this. I want to do more. The truth of the matter is, life limits each of us. Our afflictions limit each of us. There's no conflict, preacher, with the demands of ministry and the demands of life. Well, I'm overwhelmed. Don't faint. If you resign your church, you're still going to be overwhelmed.
That's right. That's right.
You quit ministry, you're still going to be overwhelmed. You give up that Sunday school class, you're still going to be overwhelmed. But that's life. Well, what do? The grace of God. I feel like if this wasn't there, I could have done more. Well, let heaven determine that. Are we doing it for us? Or are we doing it for Him? Well, if God hadn't allowed these difficulties to come into my family, I could build a larger ministry, perhaps. Are we doing that for us, or are we doing that for Him? Because if God allows something to come in your life that's an affliction, He's doing it for His glory. And so, friend, when you got a burden and your heart's broken, you got to walk to that pulpit, it's for His glory. I don't know what I'm going to say. It's for His glory. Don't lose your courage. Faint not. Sometimes I think we read from a man like the Apostle Paul and say, man, I wish I had his strength. But yeah, he had physical ailments. Well, I wish I was as good a Christian as him. He was an outstanding Christian, but he was not without persecutions. He was not without oppressions. What we go through compared to what he went through is a Sunday school picnic. But in spite of all that, he said, God's grace is enough that when I'm overwhelmed with life and ministry, I can still say, we faint not. No matter what you go through, no matter what life throws at you, let's tap into the grace of God and have Him ease that burden, a light affliction. Let's live for the glory of God. Father, help us.